Do you remember those humble sandwiches your grandparents swore by? The ones tucked into lunch pails or eaten quickly at the kitchen table? Back in the Great Depression, these weren't gourmet creations. They were survival wrapped in bread. From onions to lard, from sugar to Spam, every bite carried a story of thrift and resilience. How did such simple sandwiches keep families fed, and what can they still teach us today? Lard sandwich. The lard sandwich is one of those Depression-era creations that makes modern eaters raise an eyebrow and whisper, "Really?" But for families in the 1930s, it wasn't strange at all. It was survival. When butter was a luxury and meat was stretched as far as humanly possible, lard was the fallback fat, the pantry hero born from thrift and necessity. Rendered from pork scraps after a Sunday roast or saved carefully in a jar on the back of the stove, lard was always on hand, always waiting for its call to duty. Spread thick on bread, homemade if you were lucky, stale if you weren't, it turned something plain into something that could actually keep you going. Some households added a sprinkle of salt or sugar, tiny luxuries that transformed the sandwich into either savory fuel or a quick, sweet treat. Children carried them to school wrapped in brown paper, and factory workers tucked them into lunch pails, the grease slowly softening the bread as the day wore on. It wasn't glamorous, but it was filling. And in times when calories meant strength, that was enough. There's an odd sort of beauty in the memory of a lard sandwich. It speaks to resilience, to the way people made do with what they had and refused to go hungry without a fight. Today, of course, it sounds like a villain on a dietitian's chart. Pure fat on carbs. And yet, if you squint, you'll see its modern descendants hiding in plain sight. Isn't buttered toast just a bougie cousin of the same idea? Isn't bacon fat spread over artisan bread at a gastropub just lard's redemption arc? The lard sandwich might never trend on TikTok, but it's proof that even in the hardest times, people found a way to turn scraps into sustenance and maybe a kind of comfort. Ketchup sandwich. The ketchup sandwich was the kind of invention born out of sheer desperation, the culinary equivalent of patching your shoes with cardboard and hoping nobody noticed. When meat was too expensive and vegetables were limited to what you could coax out of a backyard garden, a bottle of ketchup became more than just a condiment. It became dinner. 2 slices of bread, preferably soft and fresh, but often day-old and stiff, were slathered with the thin, tangy tomato spread. Some folks drizzled it sparingly, others practically drowned the bread in red, but the end result was the same: a sweet and sour bite that filled the stomach, even if it didn't exactly satisfy the soul. Children often adored ketchup sandwiches because, compared to plain bread or onion between slices, ketchup tasted like a treat. It was colorful, tangy, and carried the illusion of something more elaborate. For adults, though, it was a reminder of hard times, a stopgap meal that carried the weight of empty pockets and uncertain tomorrows. Still, it was portable, it was cheap, and it offered a hit of sugar that gave just enough energy to push through a long day of work. Looking back now, the ketchup sandwich feels almost like a parody of modern food culture. We live in a world where people pay $12 for tomato jam on sourdough. And yet, in the Great Depression, the same concept would have been laughed at as a poor man's struggle meal. There's a strange irony in seeing the ketchup sandwich mocked as poverty food, while also realizing it's only a chef's twist away from being resurrected as some quirky food truck special. For grandparents who endured those lean years, though, it wasn't a gimmick. It was survival sandwiched between 2 slices of bread, and that made it priceless. Onion sandwich. The onion sandwich might sound like a dare rather than a meal, but during the Great Depression, it was a common and practical way to quiet a growling stomach without emptying the pantry. All it required was bread, store-bought if you had a nickel, homemade if you didn't, and a raw onion, sliced thick enough to remind you that, yes, you were definitely eating an onion. A little salt or a smear of lard, butter, or even mayonnaise, if you were lucky, could temper the bite, but most often it was just bread, onion, and grit. The sharp burn in your mouth doubled as proof you were still alive, and the tears it brought to your eyes may or may not have been entirely caused by the onion. For working men, an onion sandwich offered more than calories. It delivered bold flavor when everything else on the table felt muted by scarcity. Farmers could pull the onions straight from their gardens, and city dwellers could buy one for pennies that stretched across multiple sandwiches. Children might have wrinkled their noses at first, but hunger had a way of making even the strongest flavors acceptable. Besides, the pungent aftertaste lasted for hours, which some joked was its own kind of second meal. Today, the onion sandwich feels almost rebellious. In a culture obsessed with delicate flavors and deodorizing mints, the idea of biting into raw onion between slices of bread seems outrageous. And yet, if you've ever ordered a gourmet burger piled high with caramelized onions or paid extra for onion aioli on an artisanal roll, you've flirted with the same concept. The Depression-era onion sandwich wasn't a delicacy. It was resilience on a plate, a reminder that even when times were tough, people found ways to make something simple taste unforgettable. Sugar sandwich. The sugar sandwich is one of those Depression-era creations that feels almost whimsical at first glance, until you remember it was born out of hardship. It was as simple as it sounds. 2 slices of bread spread with butter, lard, or even just dampened with water, then sprinkled generously with sugar. That's it. No frills, no hidden twist, just the sweet crunch of granulated sugar between soft or sometimes stale bread. For children, it was often the closest thing they got to dessert, a treat that lit up their eyes even if it came from necessity rather than abundance. This humble sandwich carried more than sweetness. It carried energy. Sugar was cheap and easy to store. And in a time when every calorie counted, a handful poured between bread could keep kids running through chores or give adults the stamina to finish another weary shift. Parents might have apologized for the lack of meat or cheese, but children rarely complained. To them, it was a candy sandwich, something to be unwrapped from wax paper with excitement at school or on the porch after a long day. From today's perspective, the sugar sandwich seems both shocking and strangely familiar. Isn't it basically the ancestor of cinnamon toast or the sugar-sprinkled fried dough at the county fair? It's the budget version of comfort food stripped down to its essentials. Where we now pay extra for pastries dusted with artisan sugars, our grandparents made do with whatever sat in the pantry. The sugar sandwich reminds us that joy doesn't always come from abundance. It can also spring from the smallest, cheapest indulgence. In its simplicity, it captures the ingenuity of Depression kitchens, where even the bleakest circumstances couldn't entirely erase the human craving for sweetness and comfort. Salt and bread sandwich. The salt and bread sandwich may be the starkest example of just how bare-bones survival food could be during the Great Depression. Imagine 2 slices of bread, often coarse and homemade, sometimes stale and barely holding together, with nothing more than a sprinkle of salt between them. That was the meal. No butter, no lard, not even a scrap of onion or a slice of cucumber. Just bread and salt. It sounds almost absurd now, like a parody of fine dining's obsession with minimalism, but for countless families, this was reality. The salt wasn't just about taste, it sharpened the blandness of bread and, in its own way, tricked the body into believing the meal was more substantial than it really was. For many, this sandwich was eaten in silence, not because it was cherished, but because it underscored the lack of options. Children might have asked when the meat was coming back, or when butter would return to the table, but often there was no answer. Yet, the salt and bread sandwich also reveals something important about resilience. People found ways to keep going, even when all they had was the most stripped-down form of sustenance imaginable. Bread kept bellies full, and salt kept palates from despair. Looking at it now, the sandwich feels almost poetic in its simplicity. We live in an era where people willingly spend money on artisanal bread with exotic salts, pink Himalayan crystals, smoked sea salt, fleur de sel, and yet recoil at the thought of this humble depression snack. In a strange twist, the very thing born of scarcity mirrors today's foodie culture in its minimalist aesthetic. The salt and bread sandwich wasn't meant to impress, but it did its job. It kept people alive when times were at their hardest, and it stands as a quiet reminder of endurance through simplicity. Fried egg sandwich. The fried egg sandwich was a Depression-era staple that managed to feel like both a meal and a small victory. Eggs were one of the few proteins that remained relatively affordable, especially if you kept a few hens scratching in the yard. When meat was scarce or too costly, an egg fried up in a pan of bacon grease or lard could stand in as the hearty centerpiece of a sandwich. 2 slices of bread, sometimes toasted over the stove and sometimes just plain, cradled the golden yolk and crisp edges of the egg. If there was a slice of onion, a smear of mustard, or even a leaf of lettuce to add, all the better. But most often, the sandwich was just bread and egg, hot and satisfying in its simplicity. For many families, the fried egg sandwich was quick fuel that stretched across all times of the day. It was breakfast if you ate it early, lunch when wrapped in paper and taken to school or the fields, and dinner when other ingredients ran dry. Children loved it for the rich, savory taste, and parents loved it for how far a dozen eggs could go compared to meat from the butcher. There was also something reassuring in the ritual of frying an egg, watching the whites bubble and the yolk set when so much else in life felt uncertain. Today, the fried egg sandwich has been elevated into brunch menus and Instagram feeds, often dressed up with avocado, bacon, or fancy aioli. But its roots are humble, tied to kitchens where creativity and thrift were as important as flavor. At its core, it's still the same. A quick, inexpensive sandwich that proves sometimes the simplest foods are the most enduring. In hard times or good, the fried egg sandwich remains a quiet, golden comfort. Peanut butter sandwich. The peanut butter sandwich may be the closest thing the Great Depression gave us to an enduring classic. Unlike some of the era's more austere creations, Looking at You, Salt and Bread, it actually felt like a proper meal, one that children looked forward to and adults could depend on. Peanut butter was cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with protein and fat, which meant it offered both energy and staying power at a time when hunger was a constant companion. Spread between 2 slices of bread, it delivered a nutty richness that could be eaten quickly, taken to school or work, and most importantly, made people feel full. Homemakers loved peanut butter because it stretched. A single jar could last through a week of lunches, and it didn't spoil the way meat or dairy often did without refrigeration. It was also versatile. Some added a drizzle of honey or a sprinkle of sugar when times weren't quite so dire, while others paired it with sliced apples, bananas, or even a smear of molasses. But even plain, sticky peanut butter between bread was good enough to bring comfort. Children unwrapped their sandwiches at school with pride, knowing theirs looked a little more substantial than the lard or onion sandwiches their friends might be eating. In many ways, the peanut butter sandwich is the Depression survivor that never retired. Fast forward nearly a century, and it's still a lunchbox hero, though now it often wears the crown of nostalgia instead of necessity. Modern variations, almond butter, cashew butter, organic spreads, may boast fancier labels, but they're all echoes of the same simple meal that kept families fed when times were toughest. The peanut butter sandwich endures because it was more than just cheap. It was hearty, dependable, and a small comfort in a world where comfort was scarce. Bologna sandwich. The bologna sandwich is perhaps the most iconic of all Depression-era meals, a symbol of working-class ingenuity that has somehow endured across generations. Bologna itself was cheap, processed, and plentiful, often sold in thick tubes at the local butcher or sliced paper thin in grocery stores. It wasn't glamorous meat, no one pretended it was steak, but it was affordable protein, and that alone made it valuable. Sandwiched between two slices of bread, sometimes with a dab of mustard or mayonnaise if you were lucky, it became the kind of lunch that filled bellies and kept people moving through hard days. In many households, bologna sandwiches were the highlight of the week. The salty, smoky flavor felt indulgent compared to the plain starches and garden vegetables that dominated most meals. For children, it was a step up from onion or sugar sandwiches. For adults, it was a reliable, hearty option that made a dime go a long way. And when fried in a skillet until the edges curled and crisped, bologna transformed into something closer to a delicacy, especially when paired with an egg or a slice of cheese in later, less desperate years. The sandwich carried a sense of routine and normalcy in an era when so little else was secure. You could count on bologna being there, stacked in the icebox or wrapped in paper on the counter. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. Today, the bologna sandwich has taken on almost cult status. Some scoff at it as cheap filler food, while others embrace it with nostalgia, frying up slices in cast iron pans the way their grandparents did. In truth, the bologna sandwich has survived because it straddles two worlds: necessity and comfort. It was born out of scarcity, yet it lingers as a memory of resilience dressed in white bread and mustard. Spam sandwich. The Spam sandwich didn't quite begin in the Great Depression, but it became a fast friend to struggling families soon after. Introduced in 1937, Spam was the miracle meat of its time: inexpensive, shelf-stable, and capable of feeding a family with just one small tin. By the time World War II rolled around, it had become a global phenomenon, shipped overseas to soldiers and worked into countless recipes back home. But in those last lean years of the Depression, when meat was scarce and every penny stretched thin, Spam sandwiches slid onto kitchen tables as a cheap, filling solution. Spam's appeal was its flexibility. A single can could be sliced thin to make multiple sandwiches, fried in a skillet to crisp the edges, or mashed with mayonnaise for a spread. Between two slices of bread, it provided salt, fat, and protein, three things hard to come by for many households. Some families added a pickle slice or mustard for bite, while others served it plain and hot, the sizzling grease soaking into the bread like a guilty luxury. Kids often loved Spam sandwiches because the meat's mild flavor and soft texture felt indulgent compared to raw onion or plain lard. Adults, meanwhile, appreciated the reliability. Spam was always there, waiting on the pantry shelf when fresh meat wasn't. Today, Spam sandwiches live in an odd space between kitsch and culinary revival. In places like Hawaii, they're celebrated as comfort food and given gourmet twists. In mainland diners, they often appear with a wink of nostalgia, but their roots remain grounded in hard times when a canned loaf of mystery meat was less a joke and more a lifeline. The Spam sandwich is proof of how resourcefulness turns necessity into tradition, and how even the humblest foods can carve a permanent spot in our cultural memory. Fried bologna sandwich. The fried bologna sandwich was the glow-up version of the plain bologna on bread staple, a tiny luxury that didn't break the bank but made a world of difference in taste. Bologna itself was cheap and accessible, often sold in big tubes that could be sliced at home. Most families ate it cold and thin, but if someone had a few extra minutes and a hot skillet, they could transform that humble slice of processed meat into something special. Tossed into a pan with a dab of lard or butter, the bologna would sizzle, curl at the edges, and release an aroma that promised real flavor. Slapped onto bread, sometimes toasted, sometimes not, it suddenly felt like more than just survival food. It was hot, smoky, and satisfying in a way that plain bologna never could be. For kids, a fried bologna sandwich was almost a treat, the kind of lunch that made them trade fewer bites at school because they wanted to keep it for themselves. For adults, it carried the comfort of a hot meal without the expense of fresh meat. If a slice of cheese or a smear of mustard could be added, it became a small feast, the Depression-era equivalent of eating out. In households where meat was rationed or scarce, frying bologna made it feel more substantial, almost as if the family had indulged in something fancy. Today, the fried bologna sandwich sits firmly in the category of nostalgic comfort food. You'll find it in diners across the South and Midwest, sometimes dressed up with artisan bread or gourmet toppings. But at heart, it's the same sandwich your grandparents leaned on during lean years. What was once a clever way to stretch a dollar now carries the warm glow of memory, proof that resourcefulness can still taste delicious. Cucumber sandwich. The cucumber sandwich carries with it a split personality. On one side of the Atlantic, it evokes images of English high tea, delicate triangles served on porcelain plates. On the other, particularly in Depression-era America, it was stripped of elegance and transformed into a meal of pure necessity. When meat was scarce and butter was too dear, a backyard cucumber could become the star of the table. Sliced thin or thick, depending on taste and patience, the cucumbers were layered onto bread, often coarse and homemade, sometimes already going stale. A dash of salt was the common companion, though a smear of mayonnaise or lard might appear if the household had a little extra. It wasn't fancy, but it was fresh, and in summers when gardens overflowed, it was practically free. For farm families, cucumber sandwiches were a reminder of the earth's generosity, even in hard times. Children might complain at first, what kid dreams of cucumber over bologna? But hunger made quick converts. The crisp, watery bite offered relief on hot days, a small luxury when the sun beat down and meals had become monotonous. For adults, it was also practical. Cucumbers grew quickly and abundantly, stretching the pantry when wages couldn't. A basket from the garden could feed a family for weeks, each sandwich proof of resourcefulness rooted in soil. Today, the cucumber sandwich still lives in two worlds. It appears at bridal showers and tea rooms as dainty fare, but in countless family kitchens, it remains tied to simpler memories. Grandmothers slicing cucumbers at the counter, children munching quietly on the porch. In truth, the Depression-era cucumber sandwich is less about refinement than resilience. It's a reminder that sometimes the most unassuming vegetables, paired with bread and ingenuity, can carry a family through lean times with surprising grace. Lettuce sandwich. The lettuce sandwich was one of those Depression-era meals that sounded like a joke until you realized just how serious it was. When money was tight and meat was a luxury reserved for Sundays, fresh produce from a backyard garden became the backbone of the family diet. Lettuce, with its fast-growing leaves and steady supply throughout the season, often found itself pressed between two slices of bread. There wasn't always butter or mayonnaise to dress it up. Sometimes there wasn't even salt. Just lettuce and bread, plain and unadorned. A sandwich that was more about filling the stomach than thrilling the palate. For farm families, the lettuce sandwich was a reflection of abundance in scarcity. You might not have had ham or cheese, but you had rows of lettuce growing outside, free and plentiful. A few leaves torn fresh from the stalk gave a crisp bite that, for children, could feel novel compared to the mushier standbys of sugar or lard on bread. Adults might not have marveled at the flavor, but they valued the way lettuce stretched out the meal supply and added bulk where none existed. In households where food fatigue was real, swapping in lettuce gave just enough variety to keep monotony at bay. Today, the lettuce sandwich exists in a curious afterlife. To some, it's a relic of poverty, a reminder of just how bare the cupboards once were. To others, it's oddly prophetic. After all, how many modern diets lean on lettuce wraps and low-carb sandwiches? What was once the meal of last resort has been repackaged into a health trend, praised for its freshness and minimalism. But for Depression-era families, there was no talk of wellness or diet fads. The lettuce sandwich was a simple green lifeline, proof that survival sometimes grows quietly in the garden. Radish sandwich. The radish sandwich is a curious character in the gallery of Depression-era meals, sharp, peppery, and unapologetically simple. While many sandwiches of the time leaned on fats or sugars for cheap calories, the radish sandwich relied on a vegetable that was both easy to grow and quick to harvest. Radishes sprouted fast, sometimes in as little as 3 weeks, which made them a reliable crop for families trying to stretch their gardens into year-round pantries. Sliced thin and layered onto bread, the radish brought a bite that could wake up even the blandest loaf. When salt or a smear of butter was available, the flavors balanced into something rustic but surprisingly satisfying. For farm families, radishes were the scrappy underdog of the garden, always ready before the other vegetables and hardy enough to keep producing. Children often wrinkled their noses at the pungent sting, but parents praised radishes for their reliability. A radish sandwich wasn't indulgent or filling in the way a fried egg or bologna might have been, but it carried its own kind of resilience. It was crisp, refreshing, and alive with flavor, a welcome change of pace when the cupboard offered little more than starch and salt. In communities where neighbors traded produce, a handful of radishes could earn you enough for several sandwiches, making them both currency and cuisine. Looking back now, the radish sandwich feels almost ahead of its time. Modern foodies pay good money for artisan radish toast drizzled with olive oil or sprinkled with sea salt, yet Depression-era families were doing their own version decades earlier out of necessity rather than trend. What was once a poor man's quick fix has become a chic appetizer. The radish sandwich stands as a crunchy reminder that even in the leanest years, people found ways to make something bright and bold out of the humblest ingredients. Tomato sandwich. The tomato sandwich may be one of the most enduring legacies of Depression-era kitchens, a dish born from both necessity and abundance. In summer months, when gardens overflowed with ripe red tomatoes, families leaned on them heavily to stretch their food supplies. Meat might be absent, cheese too costly, but a thick slice of sun-warmed tomato between bread could feel like a real meal. Sometimes it was dressed up with a smear of mayonnaise or a sprinkle of salt and pepper, but often it was just bread and tomato, eaten quickly before chores or carried to work wrapped in wax paper. For children, the tomato sandwich often tasted like summer itself. Juicy, messy, and a little sweet, it was a bright change from the starchy monotony of sugar or lard sandwiches. Adults valued it for its practicality. A single tomato could be stretched into several sandwiches, and with gardens producing far more than families could eat fresh, it was a natural solution to hunger. In some towns, neighbors traded baskets of tomatoes back and forth, and every table seemed to feature them in one form or another. In those years, the tomato sandwich wasn't just food, it was community and survival wrapped in 2 slices of bread. Today, the tomato sandwich is a nostalgic favorite, especially in the South, where it's celebrated as comfort food rather than survival fare. Food writers wax poetic about the perfect pairing of white bread, ripe tomato, and mayonnaise, elevating it to near mythical status. Yet its roots remain humble, tied to families who made do with what they had. The Depression-era tomato sandwich was proof that even the simplest ingredients could be transformed into something memorable. It was cheap, it was filling, and it carried with it the flavor of resilience, seasoned with just a little salt and a lot of hope. Carrot and apple sandwich. The carrot and apple sandwich may sound unusual today, but in the lean years of the Great Depression, it was a clever marriage of two inexpensive, homegrown staples. Carrots were hardy, stored well through the winter, and could be pulled from a garden without much fuss. Apples, often kept in root cellars or traded at local markets, were among the most accessible fruits. Put together, grated carrot and sliced or mashed apple created a sweet, crunchy filling that turned plain bread into something refreshing and, for children especially, almost dessert-like. Some homemakers mixed the grated carrot with a dab of mayonnaise or lard to bind it, while others kept it simple with nothing but the natural juices of the fruit and vegetables soaking into the bread. Families leaned on this sandwich because it stretched ingredients beautifully. A single apple, grated and mixed with a few carrots, could feed several hungry mouths, and the combination was as colorful as it was practical. At a time when meals often looked beige and felt heavy, the bright orange and crisp sweetness of this sandwich stood out as a small reminder that food could still be enjoyable. Children unwrapped them at school lunches with more excitement than they showed for sugar or onion sandwiches, and parents appreciated the nutrition tucked between the slices. Today, the carrot and apple sandwich might sound more like a Pinterest lunchbox hack than Depression-era fare. In fact, it echoes modern trends toward fresh, plant-based meals and inventive flavor pairings. What was once necessity, grating vegetables into fruit to stretch a meal, has become something that wouldn't look out of place in a health cafe. The carrot and apple sandwich is a testament to resourcefulness, proof that even in hard times, creativity could bring both nourishment and a little unexpected delight. Banana sandwich. The banana sandwich was one of the Depression's sweeter comforts, a simple yet satisfying way to make a meal out of something that felt like a treat. Bananas, by the 1930s, had become more widely available thanks to expanding trade, and while they weren't always dirt cheap, they were still affordable compared to meat or cheese. For families trying to keep children fed and spirits lifted, a banana mashed or sliced onto bread felt like a gift. Sometimes sugar was sprinkled over the top for extra sweetness. Other times peanut butter or butter was added if the pantry allowed. But often it was just bread and banana, soft, filling, and a little bit special. Children adored banana sandwiches because they were sweet, portable, and tasted like dessert disguised as lunch. Adults appreciated them because one or two bananas could stretch into multiple sandwiches, keeping costs low while still delivering calories and a touch of comfort. In a time when meals could often feel monotonous, the banana sandwich stood out with its bright flavor and soft texture, offering something different from the endless parade of starches and garden vegetables. Parents knew that while it wasn't glamorous, it was nutritious enough to keep the family going and cheerful enough to break the gloom. Today, the banana sandwich lingers on in pockets of nostalgia and even finds itself celebrated in quirky ways, famously by Elvis Presley, who took the concept and ran with it by adding peanut butter and frying it in butter. Modern health enthusiasts might wrinkle their noses at the idea of bread plus fruit as a meal, but it's not so different from the smoothie bowls and fruit toast now sold at cafes for a premium. What began as Depression-era ingenuity survives as a reminder that comfort can be found in the humblest pairings. Apple butter sandwich. The apple butter sandwich was a Depression-era favorite that blended thrift with tradition, turning simple ingredients into something comforting and sweet. Apple butter, despite its name, contained no butter at all. It was apples cooked down slowly with spices until they transformed into a thick, caramel-colored spread. Families who had access to orchards or even just a handful of apple trees knew how to stretch their harvests into jars of this stuff, preserved carefully in cellars to last through the winter. When cupboards were nearly bare, bread spread with apple butter felt like a small luxury, rich with the taste of fruit and the warmth of cinnamon or cloves if the cook could afford them. For children, the apple butter sandwich was a delight. It resembled jam with its glossy sweetness, but carried a deeper, earthier flavor that felt more filling. For adults, it was the taste of resourcefulness, a reminder that careful planning in the fall could feed the family months later. Apple butter was shelf-stable, inexpensive, and versatile. It could appear at breakfast, in lunch pails, or even as a light supper when other options ran dry. In some communities, it wasn't just food, but an event. Apple butter boils brought neighbors together to stir giant kettles, swapping stories while ensuring everyone had jars for the season. Today, the apple butter sandwich occupies a nostalgic corner of food culture. It shows up at farmers markets and gourmet shops, now marketed as a rustic delicacy rather than survival food. Spread onto crusty bread or paired with sharp cheese, it can look downright artisanal. But at its heart, the apple butter sandwich remains what it was in the 1930s, a symbol of thrift, ingenuity, and the quiet joy of turning humble fruit into something that carried both nourishment and comfort through hard times. Molasses sandwich. The molasses sandwich was one of the Great Depression's most common sweet fixes, a humble concoction that turned pantry basics into something both filling and flavorful. Molasses, a thick byproduct of refining sugar, was cheap, shelf-stable, and widely available in households that might not have had the luxury of butter, jam, or meat. Its deep, bittersweet taste brought a richness that transformed even the stalest bread into a treat of sorts. Spread directly onto slices, sometimes with a thin smear of lard or margarine underneath. It provided quick energy for children headed to school or adults bracing themselves for long days of labor. For families, molasses was more than just a sweetener. It was a nutritional ally. Unlike refined sugar, it contained iron and trace minerals. So parents took comfort in knowing that their children were getting at least a little nourishment along with the calories. Kids often loved it too, despite its sticky mess, because it was indulgent compared to the stark simplicity of onion or salt sandwiches. The gooey sweetness soaked into bread and clung to fingers, creating memories as lasting as the flavor itself. In many communities, molasses was tied to tradition as well as thrift. It had long been a staple in rural kitchens, especially in the South, where it flavored biscuits, beans, and cornbread. The Depression simply cemented its place as a lifeline. A jar could last weeks, stretching across countless sandwiches, and gave families the sense of having something special, even in lean times. Today, the molasses sandwich has mostly faded into history, overshadowed by modern spreads and confections. Yet, its legacy remains, echoed in gingerbread, barbecue sauces, and rustic breads that still call for its distinctive flavor. What was once survival food has become a nostalgic reminder that sweetness can be found, even in the hardest of times. Honey sandwich. The honey sandwich was one of those Depression-era meals that managed to feel like a little luxury even when cupboards were nearly bare. Honey was often easier to come by than sugar, especially in rural areas where families kept hives or had neighbors who did. A simple drizzle over bread could turn a plain slice into something golden and comforting. Sometimes the honey was spread thick with butter or lard underneath, but often it was just the sticky sweetness itself, soaking into the bread and creating a meal that was both filling and nourishing. For children, a honey sandwich was a treat, almost like candy wrapped in bread. It had the allure of dessert, something bright and decadent in a world where indulgences were rare. For adults, it was practical fuel, loaded with quick energy that made it easier to get through long days of work. Honey's shelf life meant a jar could last for months, making it a reliable staple in uncertain times. Families treasured it not only for its taste, but for its versatility. It could appear at breakfast, in lunch pails, or even as a light supper when other ingredients ran out. There was also a touch of symbolism in honey. It was natural, local, and tied to the rhythms of the land, a reminder that even in the hardest years, sweetness could still be found. Communities sometimes shared jars as gifts, a small gesture of kindness when there wasn't much else to give. Today, the honey sandwich feels almost timeless. Modern food culture celebrates honey for its health benefits and artisanal varieties. Yet its Depression-era role was far simpler, survival sweetened with comfort. What was once a thrifty solution has become a nostalgic reminder that the simplest foods can carry the richest sense of solace. Marshmallow Fluff Sandwich. The marshmallow fluff sandwich was one of the rare Depression-era creations that felt more like a celebration than a compromise. While most families were scraping by with onion slices or lard on bread, those who managed to get their hands on a jar of marshmallow cream discovered a way to make childhood feel a little sweeter. Marshmallow fluff itself, invented in the 1910s and gaining popularity through the 1920s and 30s, was inexpensive compared to many other indulgences. Its airy texture and sugary punch turned an ordinary slice of bread into something magical, especially for children who longed for moments of joy in the midst of hard times. Spread thick onto soft white bread, sometimes paired with peanut butter for extra staying power, the marshmallow fluff sandwich became a treat that doubled as a meal. It wasn't nutritious in the way eggs or vegetables were, but it delivered calories, and calories were king during the Depression. For children, opening a lunch pail to find fluff between bread was the equivalent of unwrapping a present. For parents, it was a way to provide something fun and comforting, proof that even in difficult days, a little sweetness could find its way onto the table. The sandwich carried with it an air of indulgence that contrasted sharply with the more austere foods of the time. Where sugar sandwiches were stark and utilitarian, fluff sandwiches felt almost decadent, sticky fingers and all. Today, they're remembered with nostalgia, particularly in New England, where the famous Fluffernutter became a regional classic. What started as an inexpensive Depression-era treat has since become a quirky icon of American food culture. The marshmallow fluff sandwich is proof that even in times of scarcity, people sought joy. And sometimes that joy came in the form of sticky white clouds between two humble slices of bread. Chipped beef sandwich. The chipped beef sandwich is one of those Depression-era meals that straddled the line between home kitchen ingenuity and military ration practicality. Made with thin slices of dried salted beef, often referred to as chipped beef, this sandwich delivered protein in a form that could be stored for long stretches without spoiling. For families, a jar or packet of chipped beef might last weeks, with each slice carefully rationed. Placed between bread, sometimes with nothing more than a thin smear of margarine or mustard, it created a meal that was salty, chewy, and filling enough to keep hunger at bay. Its fame, of course, was cemented during World War II when chipped beef appeared regularly in military mess halls, most famously in the dish SOS, a cream gravy of chipped beef served over toast. But even before soldiers brought it home as a memory, families during the Depression were leaning on it for survival. Chipped beef sandwiches were prized for their portability, making them perfect for lunch pails carried to factories, fields, or schoolyards. The salty punch of the meat was strong enough to make stale bread taste better. And while it wasn't luxurious, it felt sturdier and more nourishing than many of the era's other minimalist sandwiches. For children, the sandwich was hit or miss. The flavor could be overwhelmingly salty, but adults appreciated its staying power. It was a way to have meat in the house without paying butcher prices, and it represented a small victory over the scarcity that defined daily life. Today, chipped beef is remembered mostly as nostalgia, tied to both Depression kitchens and mid-century military life. The chipped beef sandwich stands as a reminder of resourcefulness, a salty testament to how families stretched every ounce of food into something that felt substantial in the leanest of years. Potato sandwich. The potato sandwich was one of the most practical filling creations to come out of the Great Depression. Born from a vegetable that was cheap, hearty, and endlessly adaptable, Potatoes were the workhorse of the kitchen. Easy to grow, simple to store, and capable of stretching across countless meals. When meat was too expensive and pantry shelves were bare, a boiled or fried potato tucked between slices of bread became a sandwich that could quiet hunger and provide the kind of stick-to-your-ribs energy people needed to get through long days. There were many versions of the potato sandwich, each depending on what a family had on hand. Leftover mashed potatoes might be spread cold onto bread, sometimes with a sprinkle of salt or pepper to liven it up. Fried potato slices, crispy at the edges, offered a heartier bite. And if there was a dab of butter, lard, or gravy, it could feel almost indulgent. For families of Irish or Eastern European descent, the potato sandwich carried echoes of older traditions, where potatoes had long been a staple, making it both familiar and comforting in the face of scarcity. Children often liked potato sandwiches more than the sharper flavors of onion or radish because the taste was mild and the texture satisfying. Adults valued them for their staying power. Potatoes filled bellies cheaply, which was exactly what was needed in times of financial strain. A sack of potatoes could stretch for weeks, and every iteration of the potato sandwich was proof of just how versatile this humble tuber could be. Today, the potato sandwich shows up in unexpected places, from Indian street food stuffed with spiced potatoes to modern comfort food menus featuring fried potato creations. But at its heart, it remains what it was in the 1930s, a frugal, clever way to turn simplicity into sustenance. Cornbread sandwich. The cornbread sandwich was a Depression-era staple that spoke to regional tradition as much as it did to frugality. In the South and parts of the Midwest, cornmeal was often cheaper and more reliable than wheat flour, which meant families leaned heavily on cornbread to keep hunger at bay. Cornbread was easy to make, requiring little more than cornmeal, water or milk, a pinch of salt, and whatever fat was on hand, usually lard or drippings saved from the skillet. Once baked, the bread could be sliced and pressed around whatever filling was available, or more often than not, eaten plain as a sandwich of cornbread halves. In many homes, cornbread sandwiches were paired with whatever could be scrounged: a smear of molasses, a slice of onion, or even just a dab of bacon grease spread between the pieces. For families who had gardens, a slice of tomato or cucumber tucked inside made it feel heartier. But even when served dry, cornbread itself was filling enough to keep bellies quiet and energy steady through long workdays. For children, it might not have felt like much of a treat, but it was familiar and warm, carrying the comforting aroma of the family kitchen. Cornbread sandwiches were also a reflection of resilience and heritage. Corn had sustained generations before, from native communities to pioneer families, and during the Depression, it stepped in once again as the grain that could stretch farther than wheat or rye. The sandwich form was simply practicality at work, a way to make leftovers portable and feel more like a meal. Today, cornbread is celebrated as comfort food, served alongside chili or barbecue, sometimes gussied up with cheese and jalapenos. But the humble cornbread sandwich reminds us that in the hardest times, survival often depended on turning the simplest ingredients into something filling, familiar, and enough. Pickle sandwich. The pickle sandwich was one of those Depression-era meals that managed to pack a surprising punch despite its meager ingredients. Pickles were cheap, they kept practically forever, and they delivered a sharp tang that could transform a plain piece of bread into something memorable. A slice or two of dill laid between bread was the most common version, though sweet pickles sometimes made an appearance if that's what a household had on hand. It wasn't hearty in the way an egg or bologna sandwich might be, but it was flavorful, and sometimes flavor was just as important as fullness. For many families, pickles were a gift of thrift. Cucumbers could be grown in backyard gardens, then preserved in jars to last through the long months when fresh produce was scarce. A jar of pickles on the shelf meant you always had something to fall back on, and when meat or butter weren't available, a pickle sandwich was better than an empty plate. Children often liked the novelty of the crunch and sourness, especially compared to the more austere sugar or salt sandwiches. Adults valued the bite of vinegar and spice, a welcome change from the bland monotony of bread alone. The pickle sandwich also had a social dimension. Home canning was often a communal activity, neighbors trading jars of pickles the way they might trade loaves of bread or baskets of apples. In that sense, each sandwich carried not only sustenance but also a reminder of community and shared survival. Today, the pickle sandwich has reemerged in curious ways. Keto dieters swap out bread entirely and use pickles as the bun, while foodies rave about fried pickle sandwiches at county fairs. Yet its Depression-era version remains the simplest: bread, pickle, and the enduring proof that tang and crunch can go a long way in hard times. Amish egg salad sandwich. The Amish egg salad sandwich was a Depression-era gem that combined practicality, community tradition, and a touch of comfort. Eggs were often one of the most reliable proteins available to rural families, particularly in Amish and farming communities where hens were plentiful and self-sufficiency was a way of life. When money was tight and meat scarce, eggs could be gathered daily, boiled in batches, and turned into filling meals that cost little more than time and ingenuity. Chopped hard-boiled eggs mixed with mayonnaise or homemade dressing, seasoned with a bit of mustard, vinegar, or even pickle relish when available, created a hearty spread that transformed plain bread into a satisfying sandwich. For families, egg salad was not just economical but also communal. Amish kitchens, known for their frugality and resourcefulness, often stretched simple ingredients into dishes that could feed many mouths. Egg salad sandwiches appeared at church gatherings, barn raisings, and family tables, where they offered nourishment alongside fellowship. The sandwiches were cool, creamy, and filling, making them ideal for long workdays in the fields or quick lunches packed in baskets. Children enjoyed them because the mild flavor was far more approachable than onion or radish sandwiches, while adults valued the way a dozen eggs could feed an entire household without straining the budget. Today, the Amish egg salad sandwich still carries with it an air of timeless comfort. Recipes passed down often emphasize homemade touches: fresh eggs, mayonnaise whipped from scratch, and bread baked in wood stoves. Modern versions may add spices or fresh herbs, but the essence remains the same. A simple, frugal dish rooted in resilience and community. What was once a practical Depression-era staple has endured as a nostalgic comfort food, reminding us that sometimes the most ordinary ingredients can come together to create something quietly extraordinary. Grilled cheese. The grilled cheese sandwich, so beloved today as the ultimate comfort food, has its roots in thrift and necessity. During the Great Depression, when budgets were razor thin and meals had to stretch as far as possible, bread and cheese became a natural pairing. Bread was cheap, especially the mass-produced white loaves that were quickly becoming common, and cheese, often government-issued or bought in large blocks, was one of the few affordable proteins that could be made to last. By toasting the bread in a skillet with a dab of butter, lard, or even just a slick of bacon grease, families could transform a modest slice of cheese into a warm, melty meal that felt far more indulgent than its humble ingredients suggested. For children, a grilled cheese sandwich was a moment of joy in otherwise lean times. The gooey cheese stretching between bites felt special, a treat to savor. For adults, it was practical, quick to prepare, filling, and inexpensive. Some households served it plain, just bread and cheese crisped in the pan, while others paired it with a cup of thin tomato soup to make the meal feel complete. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot, comforting, and nourishing at a time when food often needed to be more about survival than flavor. Today, the grilled cheese has been elevated to near iconic status, featured on restaurant menus with gourmet cheeses, artisan breads, and additions like caramelized onions or bacon. Yet at its core, it remains the same Depression-era staple, a simple combination of bread, cheese, and heat. Its enduring popularity speaks to the universal comfort of warm food shared in difficult times. The grilled cheese sandwich is proof that even in hardship, people found ways to create meals that warmed not just the stomach, but the spirit too. Mayo sandwich. The mayo sandwich was one of the starkest reminders of Depression-era frugality, a creation so simple it almost feels like a joke, until you remember it was eaten out of necessity. With meat and cheese often out of reach for struggling families, mayonnaise, or its cheaper homemade cousin made from oil and egg, became the star of the show. Spread thickly between two slices of bread, it offered a creamy texture and a touch of tang that turned plain bread into something more than just dry filler. It wasn't hearty, it wasn't glamorous, but it was cheap. And in those years, that was enough. For children, a mayo sandwich could feel indulgent, especially if they'd grown tired of salt or onion between slices. The slick richness was a change from the harsh or bland flavors that dominated so many Depression tables. Adults valued it for practicality. A jar of mayonnaise, whether store-bought or whipped up at home, could stretch across dozens of sandwiches and outlast more perishable ingredients. Some families added a slice of tomato or cucumber from the garden if they had one, but the true essence of the mayo sandwich was its stark simplicity. Bread and spread, nothing more. In hindsight, the mayo sandwich is often remembered with a mix of fondness and embarrassment. It was both a comfort and a sign of scarcity, the kind of food people ate because they had no other choice. Yet today, mayonnaise is celebrated in gourmet sandwiches and elevated into fancy aiolis, proving that context shapes perception. What once symbolized struggle now hides in plain sight on cafe menus dressed up with herbs and imported oils. The Depression-era mayo sandwich stands as a reminder that even the humblest foods can carry both survival and comfort in a single bite. Mustard sandwich. The mustard sandwich was one of the Great Depression's most bare-bones meals, proof that when money ran short, flavor had to come from whatever was cheapest and most accessible. Mustard, sold in small jars for just a few cents, could last for months and offered a tangy punch that transformed plain bread into something that felt like more than just starch. Spread across a slice or two of bread, it was sharp, acidic, and biting, enough to wake up the palate, even if it didn't do much to quiet deeper hunger. Some families added a sprinkle of salt or a slice of onion to give it more substance, but often it was simply mustard and bread, eaten in silence at the table, or quickly on the way to work. For children, the mustard sandwich was rarely a favorite. The intense flavor could be overwhelming, especially compared to the sweetness of sugar or banana sandwiches. But for adults, it carried a certain practicality. It was cheap, it was quick, and it added variety to a diet that could easily become monotonous. In times when the cupboard was nearly empty, the mustard sandwich reminded families that a meal could still be made from scraps, even if it was more about taste than fullness. Today, the mustard sandwich is often remembered with a mix of humor and nostalgia, its simplicity almost shocking in contrast to the elaborate sandwiches found on modern menus. And yet, in a way, it feels prophetic. Foodies now pay good money for artisanal mustard spread across fresh sourdough, with little more than a garnish. What was once a last resort sandwich is now only a few steps removed from trendy minimalist fare. In the end, the mustard sandwich endures as a symbol of thrift, resourcefulness, and the power of bold flavor in lean times. Potato chip sandwich. The potato chip sandwich was one of those Depression-era creations that blurred the line between necessity and novelty. While many families could not afford regular cuts of meat, a cheap bag of potato chips, still a relatively new snack in the 1930s, could be stretched into something resembling a meal when layered between slices of bread. It wasn't exactly hearty, but it was salty, crunchy, and offered a welcome change from the softer, plainer sandwiches that dominated daily life. For children especially, it was fun. The kind of lunch that crunched loudly enough to make them smile even when times were tough. The sandwich itself required little more than imagination. Bread, usually white and often homemade or day-old from the bakery, became the stage for a handful of potato chips. Sometimes mustard or mayonnaise was added to bind it together, and in rare moments of indulgence, a slice of cheese or leftover vegetable found its way inside. But most of the time, it was simply chips and bread, proof that even the humblest ingredients could be reimagined. Parents appreciated it because it was cheap and easy, while children loved it because it felt like a treat disguised as lunch. Looking back, the potato chip sandwich feels like a Depression-era foreshadowing of the quirky snack combinations celebrated today. Modern diners charge extra for burgers stacked with chips, or sandwiches offering added crunch, while food influencers rave about the contrast of soft bread and crispy filling. Yet for families of the 1930s, it wasn't trend-setting. It was survival with a dash of fun. The potato chip sandwich endures as a reminder that in the leanest times, people didn't just make do. They found small ways to bring joy and texture to life, one salty, crunchy bite at a time. Leftover meatloaf sandwich. The leftover meatloaf sandwich was a Depression-era treasure, the kind of meal that carried a sense of luxury precisely because it started with something rare. Meat itself was expensive, a centerpiece reserved for special occasions or Sundays when families stretched every ounce to feed a crowded table. Meatloaf, by design, was already an exercise in frugality. Ground meat padded with breadcrumbs, oats, or whatever filler a cook could find, bound together with eggs and baked into a loaf. To have enough left over the next day for sandwiches meant the household had enjoyed not only a hearty dinner, but also the promise of a second meal, which was no small accomplishment during the leanest years. The sandwich itself was simple but deeply satisfying. A slice of cold meatloaf placed between two pieces of bread, maybe topped with a smear of mustard or ketchup if available, created a portable filling meal that could travel to school or the factory floor. Some preferred their meatloaf reheated and tucked into buttered bread, while others liked it cold, its dense texture firm enough to hold together without crumbling. Either way, it stood out among the era's simpler creations like onion or sugar sandwiches because it carried the taste of something hearty, savory, and substantial. For children, the leftover meatloaf sandwich was often a source of pride, a lunchbox meal that seemed downright enviable compared to the sparse offerings of their classmates. For adults, it was reassurance that their careful cooking and stretching of ingredients had paid off, providing not just one but two solid meals from a single loaf. Today, the leftover meatloaf sandwich still holds its place as a nostalgic comfort food. It is proof that resourcefulness could yield not only survival, but satisfaction. A reminder that even in hard times, families found ways to savor abundance, however fleeting. And there you have it. 30 of the simplest, cheapest sandwiches that kept our grandparents going through the hardest of times. Some may seem odd today, some surprisingly familiar, but all of them tell a story of resilience, resourcefulness, and making the most of what you had. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, don't forget to give this video a like, share it with someone who loves a good bit of food history, and subscribe for more stories of humble meals with big meaning.